Hey everyone, I'm Chris Lesniak,
And I'm Rob Byer, and this is
the Debate Math Podcast.
Debating Mathy Topics and Mathy Pedagogy with Mathy people just like you.
Let's get into this month's debate. Welcome to our latest episode. We're diving into a question that might seem small at first, but actually gets at some big ideas about education, tradition, and the skills we think are essential for the next generation, especially in light of all the technology available.
Since digital clocks can be found all over, including in our pockets, should students still learn to read an analog clock? That's one with the minute and hour hands moving in a circle. As educators, we know that the time is precious. There's a lot of content we need to teach.
On one side, it's a timeless skill, part of cultural literacy and a way to connect to the world around us. On the other, it's in a digital first society. Some argue it's outdated, unnecessary, and takes up valuable classroom time.
We wanted to explore this idea in more detail with our latest debate resolution. Should we teach students to read an analog clock?
Here, arguing that we should teach students to read an analog clock, we have an educator who has been an upper elementary math teacher, a math coach, an interventionist for 16 years before joining Team Mix and Math full time in 2024. She loves everything about teaching math in a conceptual and hands-on way. And before becoming a teacher, she worked at the San Francisco Zoo. It's Christy Harper. Hi, Christy.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, glad to have you here. And can you tell our listeners where you are and what your current role is?
Sure. I live in Northern California, and like you said, after I was a teacher and math specialist, interventionist, I started working full time for Team Mix and Math, and I'm currently the lead content specialist for Mix and Math. So I'm creating all of the awesome resources, videos, blogs, all of those things that we put out there into the world for teachers to understand math better and to help teach math better to their students.
Very good. And now the question we ask all of our guests, when did math first become controversial to you?
This was a tough one. So I was actually talking about this with Brittany before we came on, and we said, well, controversial is a really strong word because to me that means like controversial means, a time when people actually argued over math. And to me, arguing over math and how it should be taught, all of that didn't come into play until I was actually a math teacher. And there was the kind of math wars around Common Core and all of that about 10 years ago now. However, if I was going to say controversial in terms of me feeling like there's more than one way to do math, and that math is not just this thing that is right or wrong. I would say that started for me really, really early. My dad is a or was a, he's retired now, but he was a mechanical engineer. And so he's really good at math. And he always helped me with my math homework when I was younger. And I still remember being in probably fourth, fifth, sixth grade, and we had these like problems of the week that we had to solve. And we had this big whiteboard in my kitchen at home, and we would work on it together. And he would talk through his thinking and the way that he would talk about math and saying things like, well, if I have four tens here and five tens here, I have nine tens. And I'm like, oh, whoa, you were thinking about that in a totally different way than I was thinking about it because I just saw it as 40 and 50. And so that was the first time I remember ever thinking that math is not just one way, or there's not one way to think about math, that there's actually always, lots of sides to math. So I would say for the interest of when it really started becoming controversial in that way, it was probably pretty young. I was maybe 10 years old.
Very good. Thank you.
Now, arguing that we should not teach students to read an analog clock, we have a math educator who has worked with students and teachers in both upper elementary and middle grades. She's the founder of Mix and Math and is passionate about helping teachers grow their understanding of the math concepts they teach. She believes in the power of experiencing math through hands-on work and uses her platform to create joy in math education for teachers and students. She's also incredibly competitive, whether it's adult sports leagues, paper airplane competitions at the team retreats, or minute to win it challenges with students. It's Brittany Heggie. Hi, Brittany.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today.
Can you remind our listeners where you are and what your current role is?
Yes, so I live in North Carolina, originally from Indiana. So Indiana is my home, but I love North Carolina, close to the beaches. But my current role is I obviously run Mix and Math, and I also get to do some work in schools as well. So it's great to have my hands both in the schools and then also just reaching, teachers across the country with Mix and Math.
Awesome. And when did math first become controversial to you?
So I thought about this question because I knew you were going to ask it. I think for me, so I went to an international school when I was in elementary school. And so all of my teachers, I was in the French immersion program, which now as an adult, I'm, wondering why my parents didn't put me in the Spanish immersion program. That probably would have been a little more useful, just, in the United States. But I was in the French immersion program, and all of my teachers were from predominantly like French speaking countries. So we had like Quebec and Zimbabwe and France. And the standard algorithms there and the ones that I learned were different than the standard algorithms in the United States. And so I learned these standard algorithms. And when I then went into a different school system, all of my standard algorithms were wrong. Like I was getting the right answers, I was doing, the right work to some extent. But teachers were really pushing me to be like, oh, no, you don't set it up that way. You need to set it up this way. And I was like, but why? I'm getting the right answer. So I think that was kind of when it became, I guess, controversial, is when I realized that the way that I'd been taught math was wrong in their eyes.
Yeah, thank you to both. And with that, let's get into the debate. All right, we have two debaters here from the same company, but arguing different sides of this topic. And we're going to begin with opening statements from each of our speakers. You each have 2 minutes to present your arguments. We're starting with Christy, arguing that we should teach students to read an analog clock. So Christy, you're up first, and your time begins now.
So, when we consider why students started learning about analog clocks years ago, it was because reading time on an analog clock was a skill that they would need to use in their everyday lives. And a lot of people who advocate for them today will argue that that's still true. And it is true in some specific situations, but to me, that's not actually the most compelling reason why students should work with analog clocks today. The real reason is this: analog clocks are one of the best tools we have for helping kids understand the concept of time. By that, I mean how time is structured, the language we use to talk about it, the math behind it, basically all of the little pieces that we need in order to internalize how time works. Because time itself is actually very abstract. You can't hold an hour in your hand, right? And yet time structures every aspect of our lives, and developing time management is an essential part of functioning in our society. So analog clocks give students a physical and visual model of time, making a very abstract idea concrete. You can see the difference between 5 minutes and 45 minutes, not just as numbers on a screen, but as a short distance versus long distance around the clock face, or as a narrow wedge versus a wide wedge of the circle. And analog clocks also help show the repeating nature of time and the proportional relationships between units of time, like 60 seconds make a minute, 60 minutes make an hour, so on. So overall, teaching with analog clocks isn't really about preserving an old-fashioned skill. It's more about giving students a concrete way to understand time, which is one of the most important yet abstract forces in our everyday lives.
And now we're going to hear from Brittany. Brittany is arguing that we should not teach students to read an analog clock. Brittany, you have 2 minutes. Your time begins now.
In preparing for this debate, I learned about a cognitive bias called the status quo bias, which essentially means we as humans prefer things that are familiar, and we often have a natural tendency to resist change. In education, this bias shows up in us holding on to certain practices and continuing to teach concepts simply because it's what we've always done. When it comes to whether or not we should teach students how to read analog clocks in schools, I will be taking the opposing stance today. But I won't be arguing that we should stop teaching analog clocks tomorrow. Instead, I'll be challenging us to think critically about why we teach them and whether or not our reasoning is rooted in maintaining the status quo. 20 years ago, analog clocks were a fantastic model to use in the classroom. Students brought their real-life experiences with clocks with them into school, and teachers capitalized on this knowledge by not only developing their understanding of time, but also using the clock model to make connections to fractions, multiplication, and more. As the number of analog clocks in homes decreases and digital clocks, cell phones, and smartwatches become more prevalent for finding the time, students are coming to school with less and less real life experience with analog clocks. This means the investment of teaching time and effort required for students to successfully understand the clock model is increasing, while the reward on the other side of that work decreases because it isn't as necessary in life outside the classroom as it was 20 years ago. In this debate, my goal is that we get clear on the real value of the analog clock, separate of the comfort of familiarity we all have with it, so we can determine whether it is worth the instructional minutes we invest in it. This clarity around the benefit of teaching analog clocks, along with genuine consideration if other models would give us the same return while being more relevant, will allow us to release the things we've always done when the world changes. Because when it comes to analog clocks, what was a life skill for us won't necessarily always be a life skill for our students.
Very good. Thank you both. We're off to a strong start here. So I'm hearing Christy arguing that not just that we need this as a skill, but that this is like a visual, physical conception of time that students can grab onto. And Brittany is saying that it's a big time investment, and it seems that we're doing this partly just because the status quo, it's always been that way. So I want to ask, is this still an essential skill, Christy? Because it seems like your partner's saying not so much.
So I think there's two sides to analog clocks, right? One is learning to read time on them, and then the other is like using them as a model for time, the concept of time. And and it's tough because Brittany and I, obviously we know each other. We work for the same company. We talk through our debate arguments before we came on here, and we actually agree on far more than we disagree, even though we're on opposing sides. And I mean, there is a large part of me that does agree that I don't know that we need to teach kids to read analog clocks because it's a life skill, right? I don't know that they necessarily that our focus when using analog clocks should be on learning to read them. Instead, I would argue that it's more important to when we're using analog clocks to have the focus be more on using the clock as a model, right? Using it as a concrete way, a visual way to understand how time works, elapsed time, giving kids this actual like concrete understanding of this unit of measurement that we can't make concrete or physical in any other way. So I would argue less on the actual reading of time.
So in that sense, could we just cut the clocks and just use like fraction strips and fraction models with like circles and rectangles and just talk about time that way then and just skip the clock altogether?
I think, you know what? I think that we absolutely should use number lines, blank fraction strips and all of that to teach time as well. But that clocks are actually the only concrete model that we have that you can actually manipulate to understand time. I mean, we think about all math concepts, right? We know from years and years of studies that following the concrete representational abstract sequence is the best way to help students truly understand the concepts behind the math. And so when we're thinking about using fraction tiles or something like that, right? Like that's still a very abstract representation of time. You can't see time on a fraction strip the same way that you can see time and the way that time moves on a clock, or the same way that you can manipulate a clock to show that, okay, once I go all the way around with my minute hand, the hour increases. If I go all the way around with my minute hand, the hour increases. I would say same with the like spatial recognition on a clock. Like we all understand as adults, right? That if it's 8:48 in the morning, there's a much smaller sliver of time before the 9 o'clock hour than there is since the 8 o'clock hour started. And you can like physically see those as wider and narrower wedges on an analog clock. So I would say that absolutely we should be using other models as well, but that there's still a place for the analog clock model.
Christy, you are saying a lot of things about this, like the conceptual nature and using clocks as something that to teach more than just reading of the clock, right? So, Brittany, you created a company that's all around being more conceptual and hands-on. How do you feel about your partner's argument here? And like maybe we should be teaching analog clocks, or how do you feel?
Okay, well, first off, I think I feel like proud because I am someone in general who I want to hear all of the perspectives. Like when we have challenge, when we have pushback, like that is how we make progress rather than everybody having the same mindset, the same perspective. So the fact that her and I can be on here and have different perspectives on this, that is what is going to make each of us better. So I agree with what she is saying in that we want students to truly understand time because it is so important. My pushback on this is time is abstract and in some way, like weight, for example, is abstract. You can feel it, I guess. Like you can feel, if I'm lifting this, it's heavier than lifting this. But we use like it's to represent that, to represent the difference between pounds and ounces in the measurement conversion, we use like a number line or we use a T-chart. Time is kind of the same in the sense that if I sat here for 5 seconds and was completely silent, it would feel less awkward than if I sat here in silence for 75 seconds. Like we feel it in that way. And the relationship between an hour and minutes or minutes and seconds, we can use the same model that we use for weight, right? We can use a 2-column table or T-chart or a number line. And so, see, I've already gone off on a tangent. I forget your question, but to me, my response is I completely agree that we want students to have this conceptual understanding of time. And at the same time, are there other models that we are using in more with other math concepts that we're teaching students that would provide that conceptual understanding of time?
So, Brittany, as a follow-up, so are we saying that utilizing, I guess, as a collective, as a company, um, we're saying utilizing the clock in a way to teach other concepts like fractions, like like conceptualizing, distance between, like you said, like a sliver of time between 8:48. Christy said that 8:48 to 9, or from 8 to 8:48. Like, are we saying that maybe we could reimagine what that looks like and like utilizing clocks in a different manner and maybe less like prioritize less on the actual telling of the time? Is that what we're kind of saying here?
I think it is more my challenge with the clock is if there were no clocks anywhere out in the world, like if they and we knew in a year from now everything was going to be digital, would we bring the clock model into the classroom? Because a lot of the arguments for why we should continue to teach clocks is it's like, oh, but it's such a great representation for fractions and oh, the multiplication and all of that. If in a year we knew all clocks were going to be gone, all analog clocks, would we bring this model into the classroom and still teach it to students, knowing that, like anybody who's tried to teach students about analog clocks knows it's a challenge? Would we still use this model to make these connections between fractions and multiplication and all of that and time if we knew they would not have any outside life experience? Because if the answer is no, we probably would not go through this work if they're not going to use it in life outside the classroom. There are other models that could, support these connections. Then I think that we should be considering that as analog clocks are showing up less and less. They are not gone by any means, but let's be thinking ahead. They're certainly not as present and used as they were 20 years ago.
Well, and Christy, to allow you to kind of respond to that, if we were to say like analog clocks are going to go away in a year, which again, that's a hypothetical, not happening. But if we were to say that, like, would you shift your stance, Christy, on like, should we be teaching them, or do you still see the value in teaching analog clocks in every way that you said about the conceptual nature?
I would say, yeah, I actually really agree with what you had said before, Rob, where your take on it, where I actually do think we should rethink the way that we teach time, right? Like spend far less emphasis on actually the physical act of reading time, because that's a skill, right? And more emphasis on understanding how time works. And so would I hope that we would find a model that could make time concrete if analog clocks no longer existed? Absolutely. I still think we would need some kind of physical or hands-on model that would help us better teach students, to understand the concept of time. Hopefully, what I would guess is analog clocks would disappear, right? And then some brilliant teacher or curriculum writer or person like us working in mix and math would suddenly one day come up with this awesome idea. Oh, let's represent time on a circular number line. Because that's all it is, right? A clock is just a circular number line. And everybody would be blown away and like, wow, that's such an awesome way to conceptualize time. Because you're right, it's repeating. And once you finish 1 hour, it goes to the next hour. And people would be blown away. And essentially, my guess is that we would end up creating some sort of representation or model of time that looks very similar to an analog clock anyways. That would be my hope.
Kind of building on what you both are saying, I'm going to go to Brittany. Your part of your argument was the status quo bias of that, people just want to keep doing this thing because they've been doing it. But I want to take the opposite stance. Like, are you suggesting that we should just get rid of things if they're less common, like analog clocks, I don't know, cursive writing, like things like that? Like, is that what you're saying in your argument?
I don't think I'm saying that we should just get rid of things because they aren't relevant, but it's interesting. Christy and I have actually been having this discussion a lot lately. So I'm going to go on a little bit of tangent. I'm going to come back and answer your question if I can remember the question by the time I've gotten through my tangent. But someone on Instagram posted about how their students were not as familiar with cash anymore because everything that they're familiar with is using a debit card. So this idea that you would give a cashier more money and they would than what you owed, and then they would give you money back is like becoming more and more foreign to our students. Like my 8-year-old, I don't know that he's ever seen me pay cash for anything because I never have cash on me. And so, there's this argument of like, oh, but we should still teach it. It's good like for your brain, and we should still teach cursive because it's good for your brain. And so I think my argument is, can we find something that is, and when I say good for your brain, I mean like it challenges you and uses your brain in a different way. Can we find things that challenge your brain and have you use your brain in different ways, but that are actually more relevant to students? Like teaching students about cash. Again, I'm not saying right now we stop doing that because cash is still out. I'm not saying we stop teaching analog clocks because analog clocks are still around. But I do think we need to hold these things loosely because if they are becoming less and less relevant, can we find something that is more relevant to them and their lives outside the classroom that give them the same benefit, like benefits as teaching those other things? So maybe that answered your question. I forgot your question already.
No, that was good. Yeah, I'm wondering if we should stop teaching less common things, and you had a good thought. I want to take this to Christy now, and just say like so. Speaking of that status quo bias, those of us who like yourself who are thinking about analog clocks, are we just suffering from this bias that that's the way it is, and we should just keep doing things?
It's so interesting, Chris, because Brittany put this out in her Instagram and she said, should we teach analog clocks, yes or no? And, send me reasons why. And she, of course, shared with me what everybody was saying. And a lot of people were saying exactly that. We should do it because it still exists today. Oh, I have an analog clock in my car. There's still analog clocks that they're going to need to read in train stations or wherever. Like it's because they still exist, which is valid in some contexts for sure. And so I do think there is an element of that, this idea that, we should teach it because it's going to because it is still somehow relevant in our lives, which I think speaks to that bias. But I think Brittany and I actually are kind of arguing the same thing here, which is we shouldn't teach it because of that. What I'm arguing is we should still teach it, but not to keep teaching it because of that. Instead, to teach it for far more meaningful reasons, right? Like to teach it to actually make meaning of time, and to teach it to use analog clocks as a model to understand time. So
Can I add on to that?
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the responses I got were like, but we use the language half past and quarter past. Please tell me anybody under the age of like 30 who is using that language. And then my grandmother commented, I love my grandmother so much, but she commented and she was like, on the dementia test, they have a question about clocks. And so you have to know how to read a clock to pass the test for like, to see your cognitive brain function, all of that. And I was like, oh goodness. Well, if that is still on the test in 40 years, we're going to have a lot of diagnoses, whatever, because it's just not as many people are are reading clocks in that way. And so I think that like a lot of this this language, it all goes back to because it's what we've always done. I think this way of thinking is what keeps us stuck in education. And we are holding on to these things too tightly. And if we could like just release it and be like, okay, maybe this isn't going to be relevant, it at least opens up the creativity to think, okay, if this is a lot of work to teach and it's not super relevant, they're not going to be using this skill outside of the classroom. Maybe not now they are using it, but maybe 10 years from now, 15 years from now, they won't. I think it actually allows us to think about practices, think about shifts in our teaching that are going to be more relevant for students.
Wow, you said a lot there. And it's going to lead me into my final question. But the first thing is like, as I'm thinking about the half pass, quarter till, things like that, standards still have it written that way. So unfortunately, we are still in that space. So I guess my final question, this is going to go to both of you. Christy, I'll actually start with you. How should we address this? Like in terms of like curriculum, in terms of, standards, because we still have this language with half pass, quarter till, but how do we address it in a meaningful way? So that way we're not spending a significant amount of time on just reading the clock. So Christy, I'll start with you. Like, how would you approach this if you were a curriculum developer or a curriculum director at a school?
My dream would be to rewrite the standards so that the standard is not so focused on the scale of reading the clock and more on understanding the concept of time. And so understanding what half an hour means or a quarter of an hour means, right? And having the standards actually address that far more than kind of addressing that, but through the skill of actually just reading the clock itself, because that's a very surface level action, right? Being able to actually read it. So my dream would be to rewrite the standards so that we actually are helping kids understand more what that language means. And like we said, quarter past, half past, we don't really use that sort of language anymore, but we do use the language of half an hour, quarter of an hour, understanding, and actually analog clocks show that really nicely. Like half an hour is physically half of the circle, quarter of an hour is physically a quarter of the circle. And helping kids really make meaning of that more. That would be my dream. I mean, if I were the curriculum director at a school, I can't rewrite the standards. Obviously, they still need to be able to read the clock. But if I could rewrite the standards, that's what I would lean more towards is using it. And actually, my turn to go off on a little tangent. But this summer we did a book study in Mixed Math on figuring out fluency in mathematics. And I was thinking about one of the major, so they talk about in that book, I know it's right behind you. Perfect. One of the major things they focus on in that book is automaticities, right? There's this list of automaticities that you need to have, partners to 10, that sort of thing. And one of the automaticities that the authors really advocated for that so many teachers were blown away by because nobody really focused on them is 15s and 30s. And how awesome would it be if we could use the clock to actually help students become more automatic with their 15s and 30s? Like I know 15, 30, 45, 60, I know my 15s because of time. So how awesome would it be if we could actually, revamp how we are teaching time and have it focus much more on those conceptual things and much more on using them to actually improve students' fluency and all of that than on the skill of reading the time. That would be my hope.
And Brittany, you're the curriculum director at a school. We're stuck with these standards for now. What would you do?
Okay, so aside from changing the standards, I would say that we have these standards, and how can we teach them in a way or get to at least like one purpose of the standard or a way in which we teach a standard that is helpful for students outside of the classroom. So I actually want to give you an example. So in 4th and 5th grade, there's a standard about classifying polygons. And it's like, all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. And that feels like one of the most meaningless standards. Like I remember teaching it being like, why do kids need to know this? And the more that I dug into it and really thought about it, it is teaching categorical thinking. And so a real life example for me is I have an almond allergy. And I know that all almonds are nuts, but not all nuts are almonds. So just because something says it has peanuts in it does not mean that I have to avoid it because it's only almonds that I'm allergic to. That categorical thinking allows me to navigate my allergy. And so that is one of those things where it's like, okay, the standard is teaching this, but let's actually do the work to think about like, how can we teach the standard in a way that's relevant to students' lives outside the classroom? That's one example. There are all kinds of things in selecting medicine. Like we need that categorical thinking. With time, yes, the standard says teach time in this way, but can we use that standard and teach it in a way that is, just like Chrissy said, giving them, supporting those automaticities or giving them the understanding that they need in life outside the classroom, even if the standard maybe wasn't necessarily written with that in mind.
Wonderful. Thank you both. And I think that concludes our questioning round. We will now end by giving each side 2 minutes to make their final arguments to you.
First up is Christy. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So overall, my argument is that we absolutely need to keep analog clocks around as a way to help students understand time. I would emphasize less on the actual skill of reading time and more on using analog clocks as a model, as a concrete and physical model to help students understand time and to keep it around as a really helpful and meaningful model that students can use. It actually, as we're talking here, right, I'm looking at the abacus behind Brittany and I'm thinking about how this is maybe very similar to the abacus. I think they taught abacuses in schools for hundreds, if not thousands of years because it was a necessary tool. And then it was no longer necessary, right? Once we had technology. However, abacuses are now actually being used back at school again. We're not calling them abacuses, we're calling them number racks now because they are such a fantastic model for understanding groups of 10, groups of 5, repeated groupings of 10. They are an amazing and manipulative for understanding the way that our number system works. I believe analog clocks and the model of an analog clock is the exact same. It may not be necessary anymore to know how to read them as a life skill. However, it is really still a fantastic hands-on and concrete model for understanding the structure of time.
Okay, and with the final word, we'll hear from Brittany. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. I think that, like in closing, I just want to leave us with a few things to think about. If students are coming in with less and less background knowledge or experience with something, I think that that is an early indicator for us that it's something that they're experiencing less outside the classroom. And maybe we should be considering how that changes our practice. If they're not experiencing it outside the classroom, is that something that we need to continue to teach and put emphasis on? So, not saying we're there yet, but it is an early indicator of that. So, not holding on to this idea that certain things are life skills because it was a life skill for us. I also think that we have to be okay with releasing things when the world changes. What is relevant to us when we were students is not going to be what's relevant to our students moving forward. And then as we consider the clock as a model, we have to really think about what is like the ROI, the return on investment. With anything in any concept, we want to make sure that we are using models that are going to give us a return on the investment it takes to actually teach students the model. The area model, for example, is something that students use for a lot of different concepts all throughout, up through high school. And so the time it takes to build students' understanding of the area model so that they can use that as a tool, all throughout their math education is worth it. There's a high return on that. With the clock, we need to think about, is the investment in teaching students how to read a clock, are we getting a return on that in life outside the classroom and even their experience inside the classroom? So my call to action here is not, do not teach the analog clock tomorrow. It is more, be really intentional, be really clear on why you are spending time teaching students how to read an analog clock, and be willing to release that if we find that it's not worth the investment of time and effort to teach it.
Thank you both. That concludes this great debate. Thank you for all the wonderful insights you've given us.
And now it's up to our listeners to take a moment, Ponder the arguments, share with friends, and consider what resonated with you. Be sure to follow us on Blue Sky at Debate Math to share your thoughts on this debate. What resonated most with you?
And huge thanks to both of our guests. Thank you for your thoughtful and respectful debate. You were really professional colleagues today.
And thanks to those who are listening. Hope you enjoyed and learned from this debate.
So as we wrap up, Christy, where can listeners find you, contact you, learn more about you?
So my Instagram is math with Miss Harper. You can find me there, but also a better place is always just mixandmath.com, because that's where most of my energy goes is towards just working on things for Mix and Math.
And Brittany, where can listeners find you?
I am just Mix and Math in all of the places: YouTube, website, Instagram, TikTok. I do have a Blue Sky, though I'm not really active there. I need to check it out because I hear it's all the rave now. But yes, Mix and Math in all the places.
Awesome. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Want to learn more about incorporating debate activities into your math classroom? Go to luzniak.com/podcast to sign up for my mailing list and get your first set of example debate activities you could use with your students today. Go to luzniak.com/podcast.
Don't forget to reach out to us with comments and questions on debatemath.com, or follow us on Twitter at DebateMathPod and follow along with #DebateMathPod.
Rate us and review us on Apple Podcasts.
Or wherever you listen to this podcast. Your feedback is super important to us.
Well, that's all from us.
Looking forward to debating with you more next episode. Until next time, cheers.